All right, let's talk about A Pocket Full of Rye by Agatha Christie. So it's the sixth novel in the Miss Marple series, and I read this one right on the tail of They Do It With Mirrors, the previous Marple novel, which I quite liked in the end. I also liked A Pocket Full of Rye, quite a bit actually, and I'm not sure exactly why it is that I liked A Pocket Full of Rye as much as I did. Granted, it wasn't perfect, it was not quite as overwhelmingly delightful as some of the best Agatha Christie novels I've read, but I think it was up there among the Marple novels that I've read. I'm kind of puzzled to be saying this myself still, but let's break it down. It's not so much that it stands out in any one area, but there's a lot to like here. Its weakest points are not that weak, and because of that, I think it's quite an enjoyable novel and does end up being in many ways more than the sum of its parts. We have here quite an interesting and broad cast of characters. Not all the most likable characters, in fact, almost none of them are, but you really have quite a variety. You have Rex Fortescue to begin with, drops dead, and the fact that he drops dead within, like, I think it's the first chapter, first few pages, is in itself definitely unconventional. Not like wildly unconventional, but it definitely is more straight to the chase than almost any other Christie novels I can think of. Even the ones where the murder happens pretty quickly. Okay, here's a little puzzle I'm now thinking about that I don't know the answer to, but something for you to think about and let me know if you have an answer. In which Christie mystery novel do we have the person dead in the shortest amount of time in the novel? And let's say the death has to occur during the time span of the novel. So Five Little Pigs doesn't count, since that's an old crime. Sad Cypress, I mean, I know it opens with the trial already taking place, but it doesn't count as happening until we actually reach the narration of the death. By now, I actually, in my mind, have a few early bodies in mind, maybe one of them in a library. Not sure how they compare with this mystery in terms of actual page number, but this is also actually making me wonder when is the latest we have the first person dead in a Christie mystery novel. But I digress here. So the characters, you've got the people working in the office, although we're led to believe pretty early on that the detectives, along with a poison specialist, have deduced that the poison must have been administered before he came into the office to work. So still, though, it brings some additional characters in the story who will return at some point later in the novel. Not to mention, let's not dismiss the poison specialist professor guy, because this guy also is a great character. He's just thrilled to be involved in such a rare type of poisoning. And by the way that you can just tell he's having the time of his life working with the detectives on this poisoning case, we can be pretty sure immediately this guy knows what he's talking about. We can trust him 100%. Then we have this large household, including the members of the Fortescue family, but also the house staff working there. Quite a few of them in the house staff, actually, who come up quite often in the story and definitely have a role as well, as some of them are rather suspicious at times and are signaled pretty clearly to us from the start that we should consider them as real suspects. Then I won't go through every member of the family right now, but just to say we've got Rex Fortescue, who has sons named Lancelot and Percival Fortescue. So I guess it's pretty clear from that alone that this is going to be a dysfunctional type of family with parents who would give their kids names like that. No wonder they go by nicknames. No offense to anyone watching this with the names Lancelot or Percival. I actually like the names, but it seems like these names say more about the parents here than the boys themselves, and not good things. Then we also have this house, the country house where they all lived, called Yew Tree Lodge. So there are country house mysteries where it feels to me sort of like a generic house out there that doesn't really evoke such a picture in my mind, and this was not one of those. Like, immediately as the detective pulls up to Yew Tree Lodge, actually before they even pull up to Yew Tree Lodge, they remark on, like, Yew Tree Lodge, and the guy was poisoned with yew berries. Like, that is really weird. But then as the detective, Inspector Neal, arrives, he has this sort of disdainful musing about how this is not a lodge, this is a mansion. And of course there are yew trees all around it, which definitely gives it some character and helps me really start to imagine the place. Inspector Neal, in fact, is himself an interesting character without being too bizarre. Perhaps a bit more competent, well, definitely a bit more competent than some of the detectives we've come across in these stories, and a little bit more fun to follow along with. I mean, Inspector Slack is a good character, but he's generally more of a pseudo-antagonist than a real ally in the investigation. He's generally not someone I enjoy having around for long, as well characterized and funny as he can be at times. He's just a little bit much. But yeah, Inspector Neil here is a man who, he doesn't exactly jump to conclusions, but he generates ideas very rapidly, just devising many theories as he goes through the house, interviewing the suspects and the members of the family. And in fact, in that way, he's probably quite a bit more like me as a reader, and not just me, but many mystery readers who enjoy trying to solve the puzzle here. So this is a complicated mystery, and a little bit before the middle of it, I was actually getting a little bit worried of, oh my goodness, this is getting so complicated that I'm just gonna have to follow along and see what happens without really trying to solve it, because I'm lost. I'm not sure I'll be able to figure anything out because I'm getting kind of overwhelmed with all the multiple different threads going on. But that's like right when things sort of turn around, partly because this is about when Miss Marple arrives on the scene to investigate the death. And after just a bit longer, for as many interwoven threads as you have going on, I think it actually works out quite nicely. Personally, even though I didn't unravel all of them, I at least had a sense of, okay, I can put each set of clues into its own box, even if there may be some intersection or ambiguity remaining between the different boxes. But to talk more about what these boxes are and how they work out, we're going to have to progress into the spoiler-filled section. So, your obligatory 5-second warning beginning now. So where things start to untangle themselves is where we see these clues about a nursery rhyme, a pocket full of rye. For those of us who are not clever enough to have figured out the exact links here, Miss Marple draws all the connections for us eventually. And once she explains this, then it gets us thinking like, okay, there are a few different possibilities here to consider. It could be that the murderer is one of the avenging members of this Mackenzie family whose father was involved in a tragedy at the Blackbird mine many years ago involving Rex Fortescue. In fact, knowing Christie, whether or not this is even directly relevant to the murderers, we can be almost certain that a Ruby Mackenzie or some member of the family is going to be showing up on the scene, if not there already. There also, though, is always a clear possibility that someone is taking advantage of this rhyme, and its association with the Blackbird mine is basically intended to distract from the actual solution, which it is this. This is actually what's happening. And I think Christie kind of hopes for the reader to deduce that much, that it's more likely a bit of misdirect by the murderer, because this doesn't clear up the actual mystery. This still leaves many possibilities open. I really like when Christie kind of leaves these intermediate conclusions here for the reader to feel proud of figuring out, all while the bigger plot still remains obscured. And the nursery rhyme business here is a nice example of that. By the way, this is a mystery where the nursery rhyme works, I think, better than most cases, because it actually is critically relevant to the plot, rather than, something where Hercule Poirot is just walking around town thinking about big fat hens like in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, which is, to say the least, not one of my favorite Poirot novels. Now, one reason I really enjoyed this novel was because despite my familiarity with Christie's work, well, as a contrast, let's take some of the recent novels, which I'm not going to spoil these novels here, and they do it with mirrors. I kind of saw what was going on right from the beginning. I wasn't fooled by the mirrors, the figurative mirrors. Like, I wouldn't say it entirely ruined the magic trick, but it's a bit more like watching a room of others watch a magic trick when you've already figured out the trick to how it works. You're not awed in the same way, even if you can enjoy it. And A Murder is Announced was quite similar in that regard. I figured it out, and then I was just left to admire the execution for the rest of the novel. But despite my familiarity with a lot of the techniques Christie uses, I think I read this novel in a way probably similar to how Christie's target reader would read it. Someone who's thinking about it, but still a step or two behind her and behind Miss Marple. Towards the end of the novel, when it starts looking like, this person is guilty of something, and then it looks like, actually, that's not relevant, but that means this person is guilty. I had basically formed these same suspicions of these characters and was being presented with the almost but not quite convincing case against them at the end. And then we saw how, okay, it was actually a wrong deduction, or rather a wrong assumption or hunch. This isn't what is actually happening. And then, in sequence, we finally got to this person is the actual killer. And okay, I wouldn't say that it was like a total aha moment when the killer was revealed. Like, my reaction was more of like, okay, yeah, I totally see it. It makes a lot of sense, I will say that. I don't know if I would have really figured it out, but now that I know it, it does seem like it's the right answer. So I admire that a lot. And coming back to that trail of hunches a little bit more closely, well, Mary Dove is, I think, a little bit suspicious throughout the novel. By the end of the novel, probably too suspicious, so that we don't really think she'll end up being the killer anymore, but certainly someone to consider. But we learn partway through the novel that there is very possibly someone on the premises who is Ruby Mackenzie of the probably vengeful Mackenzie family who was allegedly wronged by Rex Fortescue many years ago. And Mary Dove doesn't have to be this woman. There are certainly other women who could fit the description, but she was certainly somewhat suspicious from early on because she was clearly present at the time of all the murders, and especially in terms of opportunity. I mean, she was the one who delivered the sandwiches to Mrs. Fortescue right before her death. Although it was suggested that the poisoning was achieved through the tea, it's not impossible that Mary Dove could have poisoned Mrs. Fortescue's sandwich and then come back later and spike the teacup with the taxine or the yew berries to create the impression that the tea had been poisoned. Now, did I ever buy that she was actually the murderer? Well, I guess I considered it a possibility needing to be ruled out, but I didn't have any idea what the motive would have been for this murder at first. And then later, once she was potentially connected, although it turns out to be a false connection, to associate her with the Mackenzie family. I mean, this could have been an avenging murder, but of course I never really bought into the avenging murder for multiple reasons, but one of those is why would the avenging murderer have carried out the other two murders? Only if the second and third victims had clear information about the circumstances of the poisoning, which didn't seem to be the case at all. I mean, it's possible she's crazy, but that doesn't make the most sense to me. Mary Dove seems like one of the least crazy people in the house. Crazy isn't something that we see too often in Christie novels, although we do have some candidates in this house, and Mary Dove is not the first one who comes to mind. What about Sir Percival? He's an interesting character to consider as well as a potential suspect. Of course, we're told that he can't really be the killer because he wasn't present on the scene. He has an alibi, but isn't that in itself a little suspicious because his alibi almost seems too good? I totally would not have been surprised if Percival had turned out at the end to be the killer, and Inspector Neal obviously was also leaning towards him as the obvious person for a while. He had the motive for sure, it's just that he wasn't around on the scene. However, the actual killer wasn't on the scene either, so we are absolutely right to question the deduction that it couldn't have been Percival because he wasn't present. Which brings us to the actual killer, Sir Lancelot Fortescue. If he is a Sir, these things are a little beyond me. He married someone who married a lord, but I don't think he's actually a Sir. Anyway, I loved how Christie, for me at least, really built up this idea in my mind of Percival as the annoying, irritable, no fun sibling who had a reputation as a do-gooder and yet was insinuated by many to have been possibly unscrupulous. And of course, his behavior doesn't really help remove that impression because Percival acts incredibly unlikable, complete opposite of his brother Lance. Everything we've been told of Lance suggests that he's bad news, but then everything that he actually does tends to charm people and gain their sympathy. I mean, all the other characters, especially the women characters, are taken in by him. It really makes him seem sympathetic. Like, I was certainly thinking the first time we hear from Lance, we hear him talking with his wife about how he was framed by his brother and, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm a good guy, but, everyone's just jealous of me. I was inclined throughout to believe that Lance really was a good guy because of this, because he seems genuine at this moment talking with his wife. Well, in fact, the whole point of this passage is for us to see him how he wants his wife and the rest of the world to see him, which is not how he actually is. I mean, I'm not going to be too hard on myself because there certainly could have been a world, an alternate narrative in which Lance was actually not a manipulative sociopath or something, but in the actual world where he is, it makes sense. And readers too will be quite possibly drawn in by him as I was, even though he hasn't. I guess the key here is that he really hasn't done anything concrete to earn that admiration or trust, other than, I was going to say, the way that he treats other people, where he tends to behave generally admirably, but actually, is he really that admirable? I mean, once he's turned us against Percival, it's easy to kind of admire how he sort of needles Percival throughout the story, even if we know it probably is in bad taste, and I'm one of the last people to actually advocate behaving this way, even with people who maybe deserve it. And it's also clear that Lance values some people's admiration more than others. It's not a secret from Christie at all. Like, every woman in the story that interacts with him is taken in with him. And he is all about that. I mean, theoretically, the reason why he didn't invite his wife Pat to the house when he first arrived on the scene, I mean, the actual reason is possibly that he knew there were other murders that were going to happen, and he wanted to protect Pat from being part of that situation and avoid her becoming a witness on accident. But when reading this story the first time, it seems more like the other ulterior motive that he has is so that he can hit on Mary Dove and on his stepmom, which is kind of gross. So yeah, probably should have been a bit more suspicious to me from the start. Really interesting character, though, in that Christie was able to somewhat endear me to him despite his flaws. As a side note, I'm currently reading the nonfiction book The Confidence Game by Maria Konnikova, which is about con artists. And I probably won't ever end up doing a full review of that one on this channel, but I am really enjoying it. And it's so interesting thinking about Lance Fortescue in relation to that book because he really fits the archetype of a con artist that Konnikova describes in that book. But again, I just really appreciated this novel for how I went through it and fell for the tricks that I think Agatha Christie wanted me to, and figured out the stuff that she wanted me to. And I was pleasantly surprised at the end in the way that it actually did all work out, which is just really satisfying to have at this stage, having read most of Christie's works, and I think really showcases her talent as a writer. And yeah, I will say that the aha moment in this one was a little bit less of a mind-blown moment and more of a, okay, yeah, that makes sense moment. I mean, the whole thing with Gladys being involved, having actually carried out the murder by accident. I mean, we knew, of course, by this point that Gladys was definitely hiding something. She knew something she shouldn't, but I was not prepared for just how involved she was. But it certainly makes sense in terms of how that story was told in her interview with the detectives. And of course, she would have been seduced by this man Bert if he was actually Lance, because Lance knows how to charm everyone. Now, deducing the motive here probably would not have been possible exactly, because pretty much everyone had a motive, and Lance's is more obscure than many, although part of his motive, at least, is not secret, as he potentially stands to inherit. But to be fair, Christie is pretty upfront about that too, and I think maybe I should have accepted that for what it was early on. When everyone has a motive, then we can no longer use the motive to infer who the murderer might have been. Although I was still tempted to evaluate which motives were stronger than others, but this was understandably a bit of a useless exercise here. So yeah, talking about this and reflecting on this novel after reading, it has really cemented my opinion that this is a strong novel. I didn't necessarily realize while reading it that I would find it as strong as I did, but yeah, personally I think this is among Christie's better novels, probably for me somewhere in the top half. Maybe not the top quarter, maybe right on the edge. Maybe I'd put it above They Do It With Mirrors, which I enjoyed in its own right, but there I just felt the weak points were a little weaker in spite of the strengths that novel had. So well done to Agatha Christie on this one, and well done to you for watching this video. Thanks for sticking with it, and I hope you enjoyed this video and this novel. Next up will be 450 from Paddington. Nothing like a good train novel to look forward to. I really mean that. I haven't read that one yet at the time of recording this one, but I am getting that itch now to blaze through the rest of the Marple novels and just finish that full Marple collection. So until 450, happy reading.